Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 news. Lando Norris on pole position for the Singapore Grand Prix. Massively important fight back though for Red Bull and especially Max Verstappen starting on the front row for tomorrow alongside his championship rival. But the happiest man of the day might possibly go to Lewis Hamilton, third on the grid, extending his incredible qualifying record here in Singapore, but in a position where he believes Mercedes may be able to capitalise tomorrow, especially with the history of Norris and Verstappen, let's say going back to a race such as Austria. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments below. Chaos to come, I'm sure, tomorrow around the streets of Singapore under the lights. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I greatly appreciate it. This was the Lizard on the track again at the start of FP3. Ushered off the track before Fernando Alonso could take him out. This was an interesting statement though today from Christian Horner because, well, we're pretty sure now that Daniel Ricciardo is losing his seat. Kim Illman even made a video saying today that basically everyone in the paddock believes that Ricciardo after this weekend is out and Liam Lawson is in mid-season for RB, and that will stay the same into next year as well. There, of course, after today, it might be a good argument to be made that, Perez, Ricciardo, Tsunoda, someone, other than maybe Sergio should be in the car at Red Bull, but that is a conversation we've had many a time before, and it doesn't seem like a conversation that Red Bull are willing to accept. But Christian Horner even says they are looking potentially at other drivers outside of their stable, even going as far to say George Russell is out of contract at the end of next year. It would be foolish not to take that into consideration, which is an interesting statement. And especially valid if, let's say, Max Verstappen were to join Mercedes, which does not seem still out of the realms of possibility as it stands today. But a great day for Max, as we'll get into. It was really clear from the very first laps of FP3 that Red Bull had found something on their car overnight. There was talk from many that they needed a miracle to get this car to work today. They were struggling heavily because they tried to have a bit of a softer suspension on the car so they could ride the curbs a bit better, because that is critical around Singapore. But as a consequence, the car aerodynamically was just not working. So today they stiffened it up massively, turned the car upside down basically, and the car was far better today. What that means for race trim, who knows? I mean, we genuinely have no idea. McLaren didn't really change their car yesterday to today. It was pretty perfect. Red Bull most certainly did. So is their race pace going to be better? Probably than it looked on yesterday's practice, but you genuinely have no idea what's going to happen to her, which is very exciting. And of course, we know how important qualifying is historically around Singapore. Also, Max was, he wasn't perfectly happy with the car. There were a couple of things that he would have liked to see change, but this was early on in FP3 when Verstappen was the man setting the early pace on the medium tyre. And also immediately, the Mercedes boys were happier as well. It's just interesting how the Mercedes, and I still believe the Red Bull as well, is kind of all over the place, as is the Ferrari. The only car that seems to be able to consistently deliver good lap times regardless of the situation, regardless of the tyres, regardless of the track temperatures or whatever, is the McLaren. Every other car does seem to have a very narrow working window, and I believe that is definitely still the case of Red Bull today. I genuinely kind of expected that once we got to Q3, Max would be nowhere again, such as what happened in Monza where he was competitive all weekends. And then Max's car just disappeared in terms of competitiveness in Q3 and in the race. So it's not impossible, I would say, tomorrow that Lando just drives away. But obviously, he will have to try and hold on to the lead after lap 1, which has been a challenge for him before. And Hamilton was on the radio saying, yeah, the car's night and day different. They were looking competitive. But they made a couple of changes to Hamilton's car. Russell's setup was definitely the superior one. Russell put in a great lap, by the way. And then Norris just absolutely destroyed it. And this was, it became very clear that, okay, the McLaren is the fastest car around here because Norris puts in a 1:29.6. And keep that lap time in mind, by the way, because that was very, very close to the pole position time that Lando eventually set. I think that would have been good enough for second on the grid as well, behind Lando's own pole position time. So Verstappen ended about 9/10 or so back. The Williams were looking pretty good. The Ferraris put in some laps, but it wasn't good enough. Leclerc was like 9/10 down. And again, Ferrari are confused because yesterday it was, well, Leclerc and Norris, who's going to get pole? One of them is looking really good to do it. And then today, Leclerc was absolutely nowhere. Neither were Ferrari, saying he's got no grip in the car. And again, there's a lot of discussions about the tyres, really. I will say this looked somewhat ominous for Sergio Perez. It was a key talking point of last weekend, the fact that, well, Perez outperformed Max, didn't outscore Max because he crashed, but he was better in qualifying, he was better in the race. Obviously, a large part of that was potentially setup related, but Perez did well in Baku. Is Perez back? Is Perez back? this type of discussion, well, Perez ain't back. And, Max obviously heard some of the criticism, I imagine, last weekend and decided to dunk some serious lap time on Perez today. This was FP3 where, he did a lap here that was only good enough for like P15, around about the pace. Well, you can see where he landed in FP3 and didn't exactly set the greatest scene. Charles Leclerc, though, there was still a feeling that, okay, maybe Ferrari have a chance. He actually tried something different on his final lap in FP3 and they adjusted the tyre pressures without bringing him into the garage, which they got fined €5,000 for. But let's get straight into qualifying, right? So Lando Norris early on, purple, and, it was very clear that he was going to be the man to beat in this session. George Russell was immediately kind of nowhere. Like, both himself and Hamilton were like 6/10 off the pace, and Russell was on the radio being like, I don't know what's going on with this car. It does not feel anywhere near the same as it did back in FP3. And this is a confusing thing that many teams are dealing with right now. Even look at Ferrari, right? They're only 2/10 off the pace back in Q1. That then fell away from them as well, and Verstappen put in a good lap time, 1/10.5 down on Norris, so it always was very clear that, okay, he was going to be competitive, and you see Perez is way back down here. So, this shouldn't be a massive surprise, to be honest. The Red Bull car is still on an absolute knife edge, and when it's on a knife edge like this, Max can handle it, Perez can't. It seems like whatever setup they're going for this weekend that is maximising the potential of the car, it is one of those setups that, is on that position where Max can, find a way around the problems, whereas Checo really struggles with it, which is maybe understandable, but like the delta again is just widened substantially, and fair play to Max being able to put this together. The question, I guess, for me is what's it going to look like in the race, and the car is still clearly problematic. It was way more hooked up today, but still Max is having some understeer, some oversteer in certain corners. We used to see Max just drive around in the RB19 and it was perfectly fine. To be fair, that didn't happen here last year. They struggled in Singapore, and Max might be able to finally win here in Singapore this year. It's definitely on the table, given Norris's lap 1 record, and I'm sure that Verstappen is going to be heavily aggressive into turn 1, or just in the first lap in general, as he may well usually be, especially with the championship standings somewhat landing in his favour right now by quite a substantial margin. This was a big one though. Ricciardo on his potentially final ever qualifying session in Formula 1. There were even rumours today that he's looking at NASCAR, IndyCar, sports cars in general, something like that to continue his next step. And Yuki just did such a good job today, right? Meanwhile, Russell on the radio saying, mate, I've got no grip. It's totally different. These tyres are so different. And Russell, we saw his comments the other day saying that Pirelli have no idea what they're doing. They don't even understand their own tyres. And Russell today said, I've got a bit in trouble for that, but I'm going to double down anyway. I'm going to say what I think and I believe, and just doesn't understand why sometimes the tyres are there and sometimes they aren't. I don't understand it. Russell thinks that Pirelli don't understand it. The only team, as I say, that it doesn't seem to affect that much is McLaren. These were the Q1 results though, so Perez does put in a good enough lap towards the end. Russell just about squeaks through. Ricciardo, Stroll, Gasly, and the 2 Saubers knocked out. Again, Bottas half a second on his teammates, but P19, P20, right? It's just tough to prove anything, really. Ricciardo wasn't a happy man, and afterwards he wanted to say what he really thought, but he said, look, if I swear I'm going to face some community service, and we'll see some further reaction from Max to that in a second. And I'm sure that Max was, well, under his breath maybe, having a few words to himself and nearly binning it in the wall here, as Stroll did last year, as Sainz did, as we'll see in a few minutes time. He gets, well, basically they're running the car very stiff here, Red Bull, and he gets onto a bump really through the final corner, bit too much on the curb, and loses the car, nearly sends it into the wall, just about manages to save it. Obviously he's well over the white line, so the lap time got deleted, but keeps the car out of the wall, which I thought was actually very impressive. And these were the laps at the start of Q2. By the end of Q2, though, it was Piastri leading the way. Hamilton then was the first man into the 129s. So it was just a very confusing session, especially for Mercedes, going from being nowhere, and all of a sudden, Hamilton's putting in purple final sectors that we'll get back to here in a second, and putting in 129s. And anything in the 129s was like a very, very good time indeed. And that was in Q2, pretty early on in Q2 as well. Verstappen then, after his failed lap, put in a mega lap to put in a 129.6, but even then Piastri went one step further, and Perez meanwhile gets knocked out of the second part of qualifying behind the 2 Williams cars, we've got to have a few words, by the way, on the Williams drivers in general here, because Albon, Colapinto's done a stunning job. I don't think anyone is going to disagree with that over his first few races, especially at relatively difficult tracks here, such as Baku and now Singapore. To be 7 thousandths of a second off Albon is incredibly impressive, but also does it raise questions on Albon, right? Because we know that over the last couple of years, he's driven against Latifi, he's driven against Logan Sargent, clearly not the greatest competition, and now Colapinto, I think, is definitely better than we expected him to be. But what does it say about Albon? Because you would expect Albon, given all his history and kind of performance in this team, to not be putting Colapinto to bed precisely, but still handling business comfortably. That has not been the case. He is getting pushed by his Argentinian teammate, no doubt about it. So I think we won't really know the answer as to whether Albon is overrated until next year when Sainz comes in. Then that's going to be a pretty interesting benchmark, because we know what Sainz has been able to be relatively competitive with Leclerc over the last few years. So Piastri puts in a 1:29.6 here, which is worthy to talk about because he could not replicate that in the final part of qualifying. What a lap, by the way, from Yuki and by Alonso, to give him his credit, because Stroll was out early. The Aston isn't very good at the moment, and Alonso is actually putting in some stellar performances lately at 43 years of age. Definitely worth shouting that out. But Yuki up to P8 just stays incredibly frustrating to me that he's not going to get even a chance at that Red Bull drive. But Perez out in the second part of qualifying, right? We talk about it with the championship contenders needing their teammates somewhere to support. At least Piastri is in the same, postcode as Lando Norris. Perez is starting from back in Baku, it seems, back down in P13 behind the two Williams. Two cars that look pretty solid, and obviously we know that Perez is, well, he made some attempts to overtake around here last year, none of which ended especially well. So, Perez kind of back to form on some level, but I think the credit really belongs to Max today doing such a stellar job as he did. This, though, was Sainz in the wall right at the start of Q3, and this is pretty rare that you see a driver starting a flying lap. He was starting his flying lap, run over a bump a little bit, lost the car, tried to save it and didn't, and was just straight in the wall at the rear. Big impact as well, to be honest, especially on the rear of the car, not where you want to crash. The engine's back there, the gearbox is back there. That could be problematic potentially for Ferrari. So few things to think about for those mechanics overnight, I'm sure of it. But Sainz in the wall, not what he wanted. Of course, he walks away, says not exactly sure what happened there. He crossed the track on foot and potentially is under investigation for that, to be honest. But during this whole period, Verstappen was just coming across the line. He, however, got his lap time deleted. There was some questions as to whether he'd get a penalty for driving through yellow flags, but actually the yellows came out, Max backed off, then he sped up again going into the line when it was still green, then the red flag drops. So, Max got his lap time deleted because if there's double yellows, everyone's time is gone, but it didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things in the end. But it was a good lap, a 1:29.7 he did. Piastri was on about a 1:30.0 at this particular point. So Max was wondering why he got the lap time deleted. In the end, as I say, it didn't massively matter. And then we go up for the final run. So there was a chance maybe with 8 minutes on the clock to try and do 2 runs, but the teams decided, all right, we're just going to do 1, get out there nice and late, put on the brand new set of soft tyres and give it the best shot. The McLarens went out first, which was definitely, I think, the correct decision, just to avoid any drama. Of course, you're going to give up a little bit of lap time and track evolution, but it's probably for the best around a circuit like Singapore when stuff like what happened to Sainz can definitely happen. Russell was then told on the radio, don't let Max through, because Max was told, hey, make up some places, get better track position here for the quali lap. Russell tried to hold Verstappen back, but he wasn't able to do so. And this was the lap here for Piastri. A big snap of oversteer through the final couple of corners. This was where he lost his lap time really here. Piastri put in a pretty decent lap, but the final chicane just couldn't quite hook it up. Maybe the tyres were slightly overheating, and eventually he ends up a few tenths off where he was in his first part of qualifying. And Norris puts on in the second part of qualifying, and it's Norris who puts in an absolutely stellar lap, a 1:29.5, taking the track record here, of course. Again, different circuit now, DRS zone in addition, so, not exactly the most impressive lap ever put together around Singapore, but nonetheless, the fastest lap ever put together around Singapore. Piastri was 4 tenths back, which will be frustrating for him, and I think it's the same reason why last weekend's I was, as many were, so massively impressed by Oscar, and for very good reason. His efficiency in the race, his ability to make those moves, holding onto the tyres in the clear air. Piastri's impressed many, but, he is 14.5 down or whatever it is in qualifying this year to Norris for a reason. Lando is a phenomenal qualifier, and Piastri does need to get better in terms of the consistency in this element of his driving, right? Because I do expect him to get better over time, but if Norris is P1 and, you know, Piastri is going to help him in the championship, Piastri has to be right there on, you know, the front or the second row. Not the case today, which, you know, potentially could hold Norris back tomorrow, as we're going to talk about in terms of execution of strategy. This, though, was Leclerc, who was putting in a decent lap, but not a great lap. Like, Ferrari clearly lost something overnight here, but Leclerc had actually already apparently gone outside our track limits. Not going to lie, from this camera angle, he looks like he's inside the track. Like, he looks like he's fine, to be honest, to me. It looks like he's just about got part of the tyre on part of the white line. But the stewards saw otherwise. They deleted the lap at the ends, and he went from kind of middle of the pack in the top 10 all the way down to P9, with Leclerc and Sainz starting P9, P10. So Leclerc's championship challenge, if it ever existed, is gone. Unless there's some absolute safety car inspired miracle tomorrow for Leclerc. You know, otherwise he's going to just be too many points behind going into the final few rounds of the season. But Norris puts in a great lap. Verstappen, Hamilton, though, was second for a brief period of time, put on a great lap in the high 129s before Verstappen just about pipped him. The crowd was going crazy when Hamilton put in this lap, actually. We know that Hamilton has been historically so good around Singapore. Hamilton actually wasn't even that happy with the final lap, thought that he didn't have as much grip as maybe he was hoping for. Verstappen a couple of tenths off Norris. Just great work from Max, I think, to at least get back in the position, because as I said yesterday and the day before, this weekend's Lando needs to put a sizable chunk into Verstappen. And Norris has done all he can. He's secured pole position, right? But Max has done a great job, and Red Bull overnight did a great job, at least keeping things competitive. But that's what I'm saying with Piastri, 4.5 tenths back roughly. That means that the two Mercedes are in his way. So, you know, he can't really be there from a strategic perspective to bother Verstappen as if he was in, let's say, third or second or something. And it's the two Mercedes that he's got to deal with as well. And in terms of winning the race, Mercedes are certainly not out of it, as we'll see in a second here. Mercedes is certainly not out of it, as we'll discuss here in a second, especially with what happened last year. Hulkenberg, though, what a performance. Again, Magnussen was out earlier on, but Hulkenberg in P6. I mean, it was Magnussen who was, I think, P6 here last year, and it has. This time it's Hulkenberg, so you know, their car some weekends just turns up, and of course he outperforms both Ferraris in the end. Alonso, Tsunoda, rounding out the top 7, top 8. So it's a phenomenal grid, I'm not going to lie, for tomorrow's race. Hamilton was really happy about the result as well. 3 tenths to P1, great recovery, guys. The grip just wasn't there that lap's right. So there's still some questions, but Mercedes will take the P3, P4, absolutely. Hamilton then said a few words to the media, saying that he's really happy with, you know, how things have been going, performing better in qualifying than he has been before. You know, he's always going to be happy beating George, right? I think often that's how it goes between those two guys, so competitive within that team, of course. And like, he expects the McLaren to just be a bit too fast. He even made another comment in an interview saying that with their rear wing moving, with their front wing moving, they are very difficult to stop right now, the flexibility of those parts of the car. But Hamilton's pretty confident that in third, given the strategic possibilities of Russell right next to him on the second row, and also given the fact that Lando and Max, you would not rule out some sort of heavy battling between them, whether there's contact, whether there's not. You know, it's absolutely possible tomorrow if what we've seen earlier in the kind of season kind of continues onwards. And Max was reasonably close enough to Lando today, but it does seem like the McLaren is going to have more pace in tomorrow's race. But obviously, if lap 1, potentially some drama can happen. There always tends to be a safety car around here. Last year, Mercedes capitalised by making the stops and then going on to put on, you know, the second stop that they made, having a much faster car towards the end of the race. But Russell wasn't able to get the move done on Norris, and of course, therefore on Sainz. Had Hamilton been the other way around to Russell last year, there's an argument that would have happened. And of course, this year, Hamilton has qualified ahead, giving him potentially the green light to make that work. And this is Hamilton's record. It's so ridiculous. Some F1 guy down here around Singapore, every time he has been to this circuit, he's qualified in the top 5, and that continues this year, despite the car being pretty terrible all day. McLaren responded to the rear wing stuff and said that there's no effect on the car. We've seen that today. We're still rapid, and basically said our competitors are distracted by this. We are going to do our talking on the track. So that's what McLaren is saying. saying they have the fastest machinery right now. It looked like Ferrari were going to be there this weekend. As I said before, I thought they were my team to watch, and watch them I did, and watch them collapse I did. And unfortunately for Leclerc, he's got a real tall order on his hands tomorrow to try and recover some points. But Verstappen's going to be pretty happy about things. You know, definitely going to be happy with second place with the way that things have gone. Look, if Lando wins tomorrow with fastest lap, without fastest lap and Max is second, that's another 7-8 points in the championship. And that's about what he needs weekend to weekend. But I think he needs more than that, right? I think that Norris needs to win, and I think he needs, you know, Verstappen something to go wrong, or the Mercedes to battle him, or something to happen, really. Ideally, Piastri, potentially, if he was able to make some progress and overtake Max, that would be ideal as well. But obviously, first of all, Lando's got to get through turn 1 and get through lap 1 in the lead, because that has been a big challenge for him so far in his career, certainly over the last 12 months or so. Verstappen, by the way, then went to the press conference and was asked questions on the car, and he didn't want to say anything. We know that he's like going to get fined or whatever, community service for swearing. So Verstappen's decided, right, screw you guys, I'm not going to give you anything. So he goes to the press conference, and when asked the question, he just says basically nothing. He says, just give short answers, and then he tells the host and the journalist, like, hey, look, I'll give you more, but I won't say it in this room. And so Luke Smith asks him on the car setup, and he says, I prefer you ask these questions outside of the room. So then he goes outside of the room, and he gets absolutely swarmed by journalists asking him all sorts of stuff. So very entertaining. He was even asked the question, how long are you not going to give any good answers in press conferences? And he says, I am answering, I'm just not saying a lot. I've got a problem with my voice, he says, which I thought was hilarious. And then Lewis was even asked to comment on the community service or whatever for Max, and he's like, I wouldn't do it, hope Max doesn't do it either. So great drama as ever here in Formula 1. But it is arguable that these are your new big 3 drivers of the sport, and we shall see if Norris can execute on that tomorrow. So very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.